Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 23 in our course on general psychology. And in this lecture, we'll wrap up the unit on personality by talking about a couple of newer theories with regard to personality. We'll also cover the ideas of self-concept and self-esteem, which are how we think of ourselves. So, looking at more aspects of personality, the two approaches that we'll be examining last, one of them is the humanistic existential approach. So we'll see this was partially a reaction to Freud's somewhat pessimistic theories uh, about human nature. And so we'll also see here that there's also an overlap with terror management theory, which we talked about back in our unit on motivation. The last approach we'll talk about is the social cognitive approach. And this is an approach that focuses more on the situations the person is embedded in. The idea that our personality doesn't entirely drive our behavior, that a lot of our behavior is situation dependent. And then again, we'll talk about self-concept and self-esteem, which are how we think of ourselves. What do we value when it comes to our personalities? How do we feel about ourselves? Do we accept the self? Do we value ourselves? So what we're going to see is that newer theories emphasize growth and change over things like innate traits or the psychodynamic theory of your personality being set by the time you're 5 years old. So we're going to see a departure from that idea that the personality is fixed and is really biologically based, or that it is based on the unconscious. We're also going to start introducing the influence of others. So other people have a big influence on our behavior. So we're going to acknowledge that with these later theories. And what other people say and do also has an impact on how we view ourselves, not just what sort of person we are, but also our impression of ourselves. And we'll also see that our impression of ourselves may not always be the most accurate, that we tend to think of ourselves as being better in many respects than we actually may be. So we'll see that at the end. So we'll start by talking about the humanistic existential approach. And this actually takes us back to Abraham Maslow, who we ran into in our unit on motivation. If we recall, Maslow developed the idea of what he called the hierarchy of needs. And this is the idea that uh, your needs have priorities. At the very basic level, you need to stay alive, you need food, you need water, you need shelter. And so those are basic needs that need to be met before more cognitive needs can be addressed. Once those needs are met, then you are free to develop relationships. You are free to engage in activities that boost your self-esteem. And at the top of the hierarchy is what Maslow called self-actualization. So the need for self-actualization is at the top of that pyramid. So it is the only something you get to if everything else has been taken care of. And self-actualization is the realization of one's potential. So it's a form of self-improvement. Uh, the idea that humans are interested in personal growth is at the core of the humanistic approach to psychology and personality. And so Maslow helped found humanistic psychology. And this is, again, a more positive outlook. So this is the idea that people are essentially good, that if given the opportunity, they will improve themselves and contribute to society. And this, of course, is in contrast to views like those of Freud. For Freud, the person was always in a battle against their dark unconscious, trying to control urges that were not acceptable, trying to control biological drives. And so Maslow's thinking was that people are, again, essentially good, and that their personality is not a product of this struggle with the unconscious. That in fact it is a series of choices where people, once they've taken care of their basic needs, really try to better themselves, try to be the best people they can. Now, another important individual in humanistic psychology was Carl Rogers, who doesn't really get talked about in your book. And Carl Rogers emphasized the need for what he called positive regard, and that is kind of like the golden rule, where if someone treats you positively, you are more likely to turn out to be a well-adjusted individual. And so this is especially important, Rogers thought, for parents to give their children what he called unconditional positive regard. The idea here is that even if the child breaks a rule or does what you don't want the child to do, that it is the behavior that should be focused on, and it is not an indicator that the child is a bad person in any sense. So it's related to unconditional love, where there are positive feelings toward the person, even if they don't always do what you would like. Rogers also emphasized and developed the usefulness of group therapy, which was a new approach. Traditionally, you had the psychologist and you had the patient. And this was going back to even to Freud, where the psychologist really drove the conversation, asked questions, determined what topics would be discussed. And there was just one patient. Group therapy, in Carl Rogers' approach, the psychologist was more of a facilitator. And so the idea was not to ask probing questions or lead the discussion. It was to allow the group and individuals in the group to achieve some level of self-insight, to discover things about themselves and understand what their problems were by helping foster a conversation. A related approach is the existential approach. And so this is an emphasis on choices during the lifetime, but with the knowledge that one is mortal, that one is eventually going to die. And so again, we can go back to our motivation unit and think about terror management theory, which of course is the idea that a lot of our choices are based on the fear of mortality, that we have to reconcile our lives with the knowledge that eventually we are going to die. And so this is a similar frame of thought by which a person has a lot of choices to make in life, but life is finite. And so how do you make the most out of life? And this leads to what existentialists call angst, which is related to the word anxiety. And the idea here is, again, you have knowledge of your death at some point, and you have all of these choices. This is what existential angst is. All these choices you could make. And so which ones do you choose? And if you choose one, you may have to forego others. And so that produces anxiety, that knowledge of our own choices and foreknowledge of our own death produces anxiety because we try to make the most out of life, but we know we can't choose everything. Another more recent approach is the social cognitive approach. And this approach emphasizes the situations in which we make decisions. So previous theories thought that behavior was driven by personality, but that may be true to a certain extent, but the social cognitive approach suggests that maybe the context matters almost as much or just as much as our inner personality. And so those external circumstances are very important. So this is what's referred to as the person-situation controversy. Are our decisions, are our behaviors driven by internal mechanisms based on our personality, or are they driven by the situation? And of course, both are true to a certain extent, but the emphasis on the situation was what the social cognitive approach really brought to the table. Also, the people around you have an impact on your behavior. So what people say about you, we'll get more to the self-concept later, but think about how different you are with your family versus your friends versus your classmates or your professors. So the people that you're surrounded with at a given moment can determine a lot of the way you talk to them, the vocabulary you use, your body language, the decisions you make. You probably make different decisions when you're with your peers versus when you're with your parents. So the other people around you are part of that situation that affects your behavior. And a big figure here in this field is George Kelly. And George Kelly developed what are called personal constructs, which are ways of thinking about the world, are ways of describing and understanding events around us. So the idea here is that the person is kind of a scientist. Uh, and not just talking about scientists here, saying that everyone is kind of a scientist. We have to try and understand the world around us. We have to try and measure it in some way. We try and make predictions about what's going to happen. And George Kelly was saying that this is as true in daily life and social interactions in particular as it is in the laboratory. That as you experience life, that you start to develop ideas about how people will respond to you if you act a certain way. Well, that's a kind of hypothesis. So if I act hostile, that is likely to produce a hostile reaction in others. So that is a form of prediction, of hypothesis. If I act a certain way, I'm likely to experience behavior X. So the idea of the person as a scientist who's accruing experience and makes predictions about other people or about the environment. That's what Kelly meant by the person as a scientist. And the way this was measured, we talked about measurement last time for trait-based approaches and for the psychodynamic approach. What Kelly used is something called the repertory grid. And so what he did was you had a list of people, and these could be specific individuals like your mother or father, but they could also be more abstract individuals like a stranger or a classmate. And so what the repertory grid did was take three of these individuals, and it asks you what dimension groups two of them, but not the third. So, given three people, your mother, father, and your best friend, you might say that two of those people are kind, or two of those people are easy to anger. And so those are categories you're using. Those are dimensions along which people are categorized. And of course, there's any number of ways to categorize people. We just talked about the trait-based approach and how many different traits are possible. So the choices you make in terms of how to categorize people, Kelly thought, uh, says a lot about you. So the dimensions along which you measure people, how you think of other people in terms of their characteristics, uh, determines in part how you respond to them, what you think of them as people. How do you respond to other individuals if you think of them mainly as generous or not generous versus male or female? So the dimensions that you emphasize say a lot about your personality. A related note, this was not Kelly's work, this is a different psychologist named Rotter, uh, but the locus of control also has sort of a scientific quality to it. So the locus of control is, again, how you view the world. And in particular, it says, do you think of the circumstances around you as being under your control, or are they governed by random chance and luck, or determined by the outside world? And so if you think that you're in control of your own destiny, so to speak, that's referred to as an internal locus of control. If, however, you think that you are the target of circumstance, that you either get lucky or don't in any given situation, that is an external locus of control. And so having an internal locus of control is, for the most part, preferable because it leads to better life outcomes um, in terms of work performance, in terms of education and health outcomes. And so that internal locus of control is important. But people vary in terms of whether they have an internal or external locus of control. And this can be measured. And again, this is sort of how you frame the world around you. Kelly was largely about framing your interactions with other people. The locus of control literature is about how you frame events that occur around you in the world. Uh, are you in charge of them, or is the world in charge of them? All right, so those are two more modern personality theories. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the self and how we conceptualize the self. And this, of course, as always, goes back to William James, one of our most important psychologists. And James made the distinction between the I and the me, as he called it. And of course, those both refer to the self, But the I was sort of the active agent, the one that behaves and experiences. The me was the target. So when other people describe us, or when events happen to us, so we have this dichotomy, this distinction between the person as an active agent and the person as something being described or something to which events happen. And this relates to what we call self-concept. And this is our knowledge of ourselves. So we know how we behave most of the time. Uh, we might have a pretty good idea of what our traits are in terms of personality. And these form the self-concept. So what we know about ourselves. Of course, what we know about ourselves depends on our having a memory for ourselves. So this is what's referred to as autobiographical memory. We've already covered memory in a previous unit. And so autobiographical memory has components certainly of episodic memory, our knowledge of past events, but it also has a component of semantic memory, knowledge and memory for facts. So we have to know facts about ourselves. We also have to remember our life experiences. And these combine to form what is called our self-narrative, literally the story we tell about ourselves. Now, when you describe someone to someone what your life has been like, you tell them your life story, so to speak. Obviously, you leave out the vast majority of details. So you really have to select what your self-narrative is. You determine what story you tell. Again, and we are very selective. So what do you talk about? Do you talk about your childhood? Do you talk about your job? Do you talk about your relationships? And so the degree to which you emphasize different aspects of your life uh, form your self-narrative. And so we also have a self-schema, and that is the traits that we ascribe to ourselves. So if you ask someone to describe themselves in terms of traits, would they say that they are kind? Would they say they're outgoing? Would they say that they are generous? Would they say that they're intelligent? And so these are all different traits, and many of them are desirable. But how we think of ourselves is determined in large part by the traits we use to describe ourselves. And so the trait, just like the events in our lives and aspects of our lives that we choose to focus on in our self-narrative, the traits that we use to describe ourselves in terms of our personalities or attributes uh, also help govern our self-concept. And the brain is involved here as well, of course. So it's been shown that when you're thinking about yourself and trying to either describe yourself or decide whether an adjective describes you, we see activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. So prefrontal cortex, of course, is particularly large in humans, and medial means toward the midline, toward the middle. And so this is a part of the brain that we think is involved, perhaps, in self-referential thought. And the prefrontal cortex is much bigger in humans, and humans have uh, a unique capacity, or at least a more advanced capacity than exists in other animals, for self-reference, for thinking about yourself, thinking about your life, thinking about yourself within the environment, planning ahead. These are all functions that require the prefrontal cortex, so it makes sense for the prefrontal cortex to be involved in these self-judgments. What's also interesting about our self-concept is that we can be kind of picky in terms of how we evaluate ourselves, how we think about ourselves. We'll talk more about self-esteem here in a minute, but the fact is that we tend to pay more attention to facts and put more value on feedback and events that fit in with our self-schema. So if part of your self-schema is intelligence, then you pay more attention to things like test scores or how well you do at trivia games than someone who doesn't put that much value on intelligence. They may value physical strength or they may value social relationships. And so, depending on your self schema, you may pay more or less attention to certain events in your life. And of course, a big player there is other people. So your self-schema comes from your own values, your own experience. But feedback from other people is also very important. And so it's tough to maintain a self-schema if no one agrees with the traits that you've decided upon for yourself. And so other people and feedback from other people is important as well. So that feedback, that information you get from other people, whether you're asking them to explicitly describe you or something more subtle where they're responding to your behavior, that feedback does inform and help modify your self-schema. And so you do pay attention to experience of other people and let that dictate, or not entirely, but at least partially, what you think about yourself. And again, people seek what's called self-verification. So that is, they pay more attention to events and feedback that confirm their self-schema. So again, if your valued trait within yourself is intelligence, you might pay more attention when you do well in a test and downplay when you don't. So you might either ignore it, may not be as good at remembering poor performance, or you may explain away poor performance. Say, oh, well, I was not feeling well that day, or that wasn't a fair test. And meanwhile, you'll be much more quick to take credit for your successes. Oh, I did well on that test because I'm an intelligent person. It's part of my self-schema. And so we see a distinction there. You don't try to write off good performance with regard to the external environment or unusual circumstances. But those events that don't fit your self-schema, you do try to explain away. So we can see a comparison here to confirmation bias, the idea that we pay attention to information that confirms our beliefs and tend to ignore or downplay information that contradicts our beliefs. And finally, that brings us to self-esteem, which is related to self-concept, but is in a sense the opposite. Self-concept is what you know about yourself. Self-esteem is what you feel about yourself. So it's the extent to which a person likes themselves, values themselves, accepts themselves. And having high self-esteem, having high value on yourself, it can be beneficial. It's not a huge effect, but it is significant. So people with high self-esteem tend to perform better at tasks. They tend to persist more. They also tend to cope with stress better, which of course can affect health outcomes. So having high self-esteem in general is a good idea. Of course, it can be taken to an extreme with what we call narcissism, which is an inflated sense of self-esteem, often associated with the idea that one is perfect or infallible or better than everyone else in every way. We'll talk more about that when we get to personality disorders in a later unit. A lot of self-esteem is based on comparison to others or getting feedback from others. So this is a picture from an Olympic medal ceremony, and this has been documented over and over again, that if you ask people to rate how happy each person looks, that the gold medalist tends to be the happiest, but the second happiest is not the silver medalist, who got second place. It's the bronze medalist. The idea being that the gold medalist is happy because he or she outperformed everyone else and can compare themselves to everybody else. The bronze medalist is comparing him or herself to the people that didn't get a medal. So they're happy by comparison. The silver medalist is making comparison between themselves and the gold. And so they're not quite as happy because they didn't perform as well as the gold medalist. And this is not just true in the Olympics, it's true for feedback in general. Also, the feedback from an authority figure can be especially powerful. So if someone we respect or admire has negative feedback for us, that can affect our self-esteem more than just your average person. There's also what's called the self-serving bias, and this is related to what I mentioned on self-concept and self-schema. So self-serving bias is, again, that tendency to accentuate those events that would give you positive self-esteem and downplay those events that would decrease your self-esteem, similar to how you accentuate or downplay events that reinforce or contradict your self-concept. So that's the self-serving bias, the idea that we try to build up our own self-esteem by selectively paying attention to events that would enhance our self-esteem or degrade it. This is related to what's called the Lake Wobegon effect. That title is from a series of stories by an artist named Garrison Keillor, and the reason it's called that is that Garrison Keillor always wraps up each story with the line, "That's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are smart, the men are good looking, and all the children are above average." Uh, and that's why it's funny, is because of course not everyone can't be above average. People have to be above average, below average, and at the average. That's what the average is. It is the middle. And so the Lake Wobegon effect refers to the fact that if you ask people about skills, they will often report they are above average. So if you ask people how good a driver they are, that's a famous one. They will almost always say they are a better than average driver. But of course, everyone can't be a better than average driver. It defies the concept of the average. And so people have this bias to make themselves seem better than the average person, when in fact, of course, the average person is by definition average. This also relates to what's called implicit egotism, which is a very interesting phenomenon by which people will unconsciously uh, make choices that either boost their own self-esteem or that kind of reinforce their ego. And so the famous example from your book is that people will be biased toward living in places that have something in common with their name. So I think it uses the example of Louise's predominantly moving to Louisiana. So it's not a huge effect, of course. Not every person named Louise lives in Louisiana, but more people than you would expect named Louise moved to Louisiana. Charles moved to Charleston, and so on. So this is an example of a very subtle, unconscious bias in our decision making that emphasizes our self-esteem or our self-concept. Okay, that will do it for this unit on personality. Next time, we're going to start looking at social psychology and social function. So we'll look at social behaviors like aggression, cooperation, altruism. We'll also look at sexual relationships. So what influences sexual relationships? What do we know about sexual relationships as it pertains to psychology? And we'll also look at influence. How do we influence one another? What do we understand about other people? And that will bring us to phenomena like conformity. So we'll do all of that in the next unit, and I will see you then.